The first time I sang inside that mansion, I did not know I was about to break a grief that had held a man silent for 11 years. I was 32. My knees ached from a double shift, and I was polishing a piano nobody had touched since the summer of 2014. The room smelled of dust and closed window heat, and down the marble hallway a godfather sat staring at a photograph of the wife he had buried. My name is Gianna Vale. I was a curvy former lounge singer turned live-in maid at the Belucci estate in Newport, and I only sang because I thought I was alone. I was not. The old man in the doorway had not smiled since the day his wife's casket was lowered into the ground, and when the final Sicilian verse left my mouth, his face changed in a way 3 doctors and a priest had failed to change in a decade. He whispered one word: Harbor Street. Then he asked me a question that made my hands go cold on the polishing rag. He asked if my mother had ever lived there. My mother had been dead 9 months. I had never spoken her name inside that house, and I had no idea how a 77-year-old mafia patriarch in a silk robe knew a place my mother had begged me, on her deathbed, never to search for. If you know what it feels like to have a stranger say your dead mother's secret out loud, please tap the like button before you scroll on, because what happened next is the reason I am still alive to tell any of it, and the reason a godfather who had not spoken above a whisper in 11 years began asking, out loud, for a name he had never known. I had arrived at the Belucci estate 3 weeks earlier with 2 suitcases and $41 in a checking account. My mother, Rosa Vale, had died in April after 8 months of pancreatic cancer. By June, the man I had trusted with our savings had emptied the account and vanished into Florida with a woman who worked at the diner across from our bank. The Providence Women's Boarding House, where I had been sleeping, shut its doors on a Tuesday, condemned for a foundation crack no one could afford to fix. By Thursday, I was answering an ad for live-in domestic help on an estate I could not have afforded to drive past on a Sunday drive. The wages were good, the room came with meals, and nobody asked why a woman who once sang standards in hotel lounges was willing to scrub floors for strangers. The estate belonged to Dario Belucci, 49 years old, a man who wore charcoal suits the way other men wore skin. He was the current head of the family, and when he interviewed me in the West Parlor, he did not once raise his voice, yet I felt every word he did not say. He told me the rules in 9 sentences, and every sentence was a small locked door I would learn. Later, was hiding a much larger one behind it. I was not to speak to his father unless spoken to. I was not to enter the music room on the 2nd floor. I was not to repeat anything I heard inside those walls, to anyone, for any reason, ever. Then he asked me why I needed the job so badly that I would agree to those rules without a lawyer. I told him the truth, that I had nowhere else to go and no one left to call. He hired me on the spot, but he did it without warmth, the way a man signs for a package he did not order. For the first 2 weeks I did not see the old godfather at all. Tommaso Belucci was a rumor in that house. The other staff spoke of him only in past tense, as though he were already gone. His meals were left outside a heavy oak door and taken back untouched more often than not, and no one asked why. A private nurse came at 8 and left at 4, and she did not once look me in the eye when we passed. His son visited him twice a day and came out looking older each time, straightening his cuffs like a man reassembling armor. Mrs. Priya, the housekeeper, told me Tommaso had not spoken more than a handful of sentences since his wife Evelina died in the summer of 2015. He had not laughed, he had not smiled, he had not felt anything at all. On the morning of my 22nd day, Mrs. Priya asked me to air out the music room. She said Mr. Dario wanted it dusted before an anniversary he refused to name, and she said it in the tone of a woman handing off a task she had refused for a decade. I climbed the back stairs with a bucket and a soft cloth, and when I pushed open the door I felt something shift in my chest that had nothing to do with the job. The room was frozen. A grand piano sat under a linen sheet gone yellow at the corners. Sheet music from a decade ago still curled on a music stand. A woman's shawl hung across the back of a velvet chair, as though she had stepped out for a glass of water and simply never returned. The window faced the harbor, and it was the only window in that entire mansion that had been left cracked open, as if someone still could not bear to close it. I do not know why I sang. Maybe because the shawl was the same rust color my mother used to wear on Sunday mornings walking me to Mass. Maybe because the harbor light through the linen sheet looked like the light in the little Providence apartment where Rosa taught me every song she knew. Maybe because a room that quiet was asking to be answered, and I was the only one there to answer it. What I sang was an old Sicilian work song about women mending nets on the shore, waiting for boats that might not come home. My mother had learned it from her own mother, and she had taught it to me before I could read a single word of English. There was a final verse most singers do not know, a verse that was never written down, a verse my mother said belonged only to women who had earned it. I sang it soft, thinking myself alone. When I turned around, an old man in a silk robe was standing in the doorway with tears running down a face that had forgotten how to make them. And he was smiling. He was smiling the way a man smiles when a locked door inside his chest finally gives. I dropped the polishing cloth. I did not know who he was, only that I had violated a rule, and that in a house like this, a violated rule could cost a person more than a paycheck. But he did not look angry. He looked like a man who had been underwater for 11 years and had just broken the surface for the first breath. He walked into the room without his cane, one slow step at a time, and he sat down at the piano bench with the careful grace of a man who was not sure his knees would hold. He asked me, in a voice roughened by silence, where I had learned the last verse. I told him, my mother. He asked me my mother's name. I said Rosa Vale. He closed his eyes, and his lips moved soundlessly around the shape of it. Then he asked me, very quietly, if my mother had ever lived on Harbor Street, and that is the moment the floor tilted under my feet. My mother had made me swear, 3 days before she died, that I would never go looking for a place by that name. She had gripped my wrist with the last strength in her hand, her eyes bright with morphine and something older than morphine, and she had said the words twice. She said some doors, once opened, could not be closed again. She said the people I would find behind them owed me nothing, and I owed them nothing, and that was the shape of the peace she had made. She never told me what any of it meant, and now a Mafia Godfather I had met exactly once was asking me if my mother had lived at the very address she had spent her last breath warning me away from. I did not answer. I could not. Behind him in the hallway, I heard footsteps. Dario Belucci had heard the piano. He had heard the singing, and he had heard his father speak more words in 90 seconds than he had heard in 11 years. He stood in the doorway and did not move, and his eyes went from his father's wet face to my trembling hands to the cracked window facing the harbor. Something in his jaw locked so hard I could see the muscle jump beneath the clean line of his shave. He did not raise his voice. He never did. He simply asked me, in that flat, quiet tone that felt more dangerous than a shout, to step out of the room and follow him to the study. His father caught my sleeve as I passed, and with a strength that surprised me for a man who had barely stood in a decade, he said, "Do not send her away, please, not yet." Dario studied his father for a long moment, then he studied me, and then, without a word, he nodded once and let go of the doorframe and walked back down the hall alone, his footsteps measured, his shoulders carrying something heavier than they had when he walked up. I stood in the music room with a stranger's father and a stranger's silence, and I understood, for the first time in my whole ordinary life, that I had walked into something I would not walk out of unchanged. That night, I sat on the narrow bed in my staff room, and I could not stop shaking. I could still smell the closed window heat of the music room on my collar. I called the number my mother had written inside the cover of her old prayer book, a number I had never dialed in my life, the number of a woman named Sister Agnes, who had run the Providence boarding house before it closed. Sister Agnes answered on the fourth ring, and when I said the words Harbor Street, she went so quiet I thought the line had dropped. Then she said, "Gianna, sweetheart, your mother did not want you in that world. Whatever you have walked into, you walk out of it tomorrow morning." But I could not walk out. I had $41 and no forwarding address, and somewhere down that marble hallway, an old man was smiling because of me. The next morning, Dario asked me to sit with him at the breakfast table. He did not eat. He watched me eat, and he waited until I had swallowed the last of the toast before he spoke. Then he asked me to tell him everything I knew about my mother, and everything I knew about Harbor Street, and everything I remembered about a song I had learned before I could read a word of English. I told him what little I knew. Rosa Vale had been a seamstress in Providence, working out of the back room of a dry cleaner for 30 years. She had come from Sicily as a child on a boat that took 11 days. She had never married my father, who left before I was born and sent a Christmas card twice in my life. She had raised me alone above a bakery that smelled of on ice and burned sugar. She had taught me every song she knew, and she had told me at the very end that some places were kinder in memory than in truth. Dario listened without interrupting, his hands folded on the tablecloth, his coffee going cold. When I finished, he told me something that I have carried in my chest ever since. He said his mother, Evelina, had a friend in Providence, a seamstress, whose name he had never known. He said his mother had disappeared for 4 months in the winter of 1972, before she was engaged to his father, and no one in the family had ever been able to tell him where she had gone, though many had tried, some of them cruelly. He said, in the 11 years since her funeral, he had turned over every stone in this state, trying to understand the woman who had raised him, and he had never found her. Until yesterday. Until a maid he had hired for $41 sang a verse his mother used to hum while she braided his hair on Sunday nights. He did not ask me to stay. He asked me if I would let him find out the truth, together, and whatever it cost, he would pay for it. I said yes before I had thought it through. A door had opened, and I had promised at Rosa's grave that I would walk through any door that ever opened. If you have ever wished for one more conversation with someone you have lost, and if this story is holding you the way it is holding me telling it, please leave a comment telling me who you would ask about. The people we lose keep speaking long after we stop listening. And please subscribe, because what Dario found next is the reason a mafia boss burned down his own alliance to protect a woman who had been dead for 11 years. Dario hired an archivist, not a family accountant, not a fixer, not one of the men who lived in the guest house and never smiled. An archivist. A quiet woman in her 60s named Miss Delane, who came to the estate with white cotton gloves and a wheeled case of empty folders. She spoke softly, and she did not flinch at the Beluccis name the way most people did. And she treated the boxes she was given as though they were people who deserved to be heard. For 9 days she sat in a locked office off the library, working through boxes I had never seen carried in, ledgers bound in cracked leather, envelopes tied with string, photographs sleeved in yellowed paper. She took no meals with us. She left every night by the side door and returned every morning at 7. On the 10th morning, she asked to meet with Dario and me together, and Tommaso insisted on being there too, in his wheelchair. He wore the same rust-colored shawl I had seen in the music room draped across his knees. He had asked, that week, whether he could keep the shawl in his room. Dario had said yes, and had not asked why. The 3 of us sat at the mahogany table like people waiting for the verdict of a trial no one had wanted to hold. Miss Delane did not use dramatic language. She simply laid out 3 folders and opened them one at a time. The first folder held a registry from a women's boarding house on Harbor Street in Providence, dated the winter of 1972. 2 names were circled in soft pencil, in the neat hand of a woman who had known them both. Rosa Vale, seamstress, 22 years old. And, under an assumed surname, Evelina Rinaldi, no listed occupation, 21. I put my hand flat on the table to keep it from shaking, and I felt Dario's shoulder go still beside me. The second folder held 49 years of quiet monthly payments, wired every first of the month, from a private account under a name I did not recognize, to a foundation that had once owned the Harbor Street building outright. The third folder held a charitable use restriction, notarized in 1974. It required the building to remain, in perpetuity, a residence for women fleeing arranged marriages, abusive homes, or the simple poverty of having nowhere else to go. The account had belonged to Evelina Belucci. She had funded Harbor Street, in secret, from the year she married Tommaso until the week before she died. Tommaso did not cry. He sat very still, and his hand tightened on the arm of the wheelchair until his knuckles went white, and then he asked Miss Delane, in the same roughened voice I had first heard in the music room, whether his wife had ever been in love with another man. Miss Delane looked at him kindly and said no. She said Evelina had lived at Harbor Street for 4 months in 1972 to escape an engagement her own family had arranged, an engagement to a man twice her age she had never met, in a deal that involved land in Palermo and a debt she had not signed for. She said Rosa Vale had shared a room with her, had lent her a different surname to keep the family off her trail. Rosa had taught her the Sicilian song about mending nets, and had helped her find the courage to walk out of that boarding house and choose, of her own free will, the young Tommaso Belucci she had met 3 summers before at a wedding in Federal Hill. Evelina had added the final verse herself, as a private joke, a promise she had whispered to Rosa the night she left. Leave the window open. The woman who leaves by choice is the only woman who ever truly returns. Tommaso covered his face with his hands, and then, softly, he laughed. He laughed the way a man laughs when he understands, at last, that he was not chosen out of duty. He was chosen out of freedom. He laughed until his shoulders shook, and Dario, who had not touched his father in years, reached across and put a hand on his back and held it there, and I looked away because it did not feel like a moment I had earned yet. But Miss Delane was not finished. She turned the 3rd folder toward Dario and pointed to a clause near the bottom, half buried under a decades-old signature. 6 months earlier, a foundation run by a man named Massimo Marsano had quietly purchased the ground lease under Harbor Street through a shell corporation and had begun the process of displacing the residents. The building was to be gutted and reopened as a members-only social club bearing Evelina's name, in what Marsano had publicly called a tribute to a great Newport lady. In private, according to the archivist's paper trail, 7 women had already been evicted with cash offers small enough to feel like insults. 2 were sleeping in their cars. 1 had gone back to the husband she had run from, and the housing court had already closed her file. Dario went very still. I had seen him quiet before. I had never seen him this quiet. He asked Miss Delane one question. When was the next meeting between the Belucci family and the Marzano family? She checked her notebook and said, Friday night, at the Alliance signing dinner, where the 2 families were scheduled to formalize a shipping partnership worth more than the entire Belucci estate had earned in the last decade combined. Dario looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at his father. Then he said, We are going to that dinner, all 3 of us. I told him I was a maid. I told him I did not belong at a table with men who owned harbors. He said I was not going as a maid. I was going as the daughter of Rosa Vale, and I was going to sit in the chair my mother had earned 54 years ago. He said if I did not want to go, he would respect that, and he would still cancel the alliance, alone, and take whatever came. But he asked me, please, to consider it, because a room full of men were about to profit from the erasure of the 2 women who had built the only real thing in his life, and he did not want to walk into that room without one of their daughters beside him. I said yes, not because he asked, because I could hear my mother's voice, at last, in the space behind my ribs, and she was not warning me away anymore. She was telling me to go. She was telling me the door she had made me swear not to open had been waiting for me all along, and that the woman she had raised me to be was finally strong enough to walk through it and to sing on the other side. If you had been sitting at that table, and you had watched what happened next, would you have signed the alliance to protect your family's fortune, or would you have burned it down to protect 2 dead women's names? I want to know. Tell me in the comments, because I have thought about that question every day since, and I still do not know if what we did that Friday night was brave or reckless, or simply the only thing left to do. The 3 days before that dinner were the longest of my life. Tommaso insisted on coming out of his room for meals. He sat at the head of the table in a pressed shirt his son had laid out for him, and he asked me questions about my mother I did not always know how to answer. He wanted to know if Rosa had ever remarried, whether she had been happy, whether she had spoken of Evelina in her last months, whether she had suffered at the end. I told him what I knew. Rosa had never remarried. She had been happy in small ways, the way women who raised children alone learn to measure happiness, in warm bread and a paid electric bill and a Sunday supper. She had never once said the name Evelina in my hearing. She had suffered, yes, but she had not been afraid, and at the end she had asked me to sing the Mending Net song. She had died before I reached the final verse. Tommaso listened as though every sentence was a coin dropped into a well he had thought was empty. On the second night, without asking, he took my hand across the table and thanked me for singing in a room I had been told not to enter. He said, "Sometimes the only person who can open a locked door is the person who does not know it is locked." And then, for the second time, he smiled. Dario, meanwhile, worked. He did not sleep. He met with lawyers, with 2 judges, with a private auditor from Boston who arrived by ferry and left the same night without giving his name to the staff. He was building something, and he would not tell me what. When I asked, he only said, "I am going to give you a choice, and I am going to make sure the choice is real." That was the closest thing to romance any man had said to me in a decade. He said it while sliding a document across the table without touching my hand. The document was a check for the 3 weeks of wages I had earned as a maid, plus a severance no live-in maid had ever received. There was a note in his handwriting that said, "Whatever you decide on Friday, this is yours already. You are not paid to be at that table." I put the check in my pocket. I did not cash it. I wanted to know, when I sat down at that dinner, that I was there because I had chosen to be there, and not because I owed anyone a seat. On Friday morning, I put on the one dress my mother had left me, black, plain, with a collar she had stitched herself. I braided my hair the way she used to braid it before recitals. In the mirror, I saw Rosa's chin and Rosa's shoulders, and for the first time in 9 months, I did not miss her. I felt her, standing behind my shoulder, the way she used to stand behind me at recitals. The alliance signing dinner was held in a private room on the 2nd floor of a restaurant overlooking the water. 12 men in dark suits, 2 women, counting me. Massimo Marzano was 55 years old, silver-haired, and he smiled at me the way a man smiles at a coat he intends to buy at the end of the season, without asking the coat's opinion. He had brought a leather folio with the proposed partnership contract, and behind it a smaller folder containing the renderings of the future Evelina Belucci Social Club, crystal chandeliers, a rooftop terrace with a view of the same harbor Evelina had watched from a 3rd-floor window 54 years ago, a membership fee of $80,000 a year, plus a sponsor's signature. Dario let him speak. He let him toast the joining of 2 great families. He let him unveil the renderings and describe, in warm public tones that carried to every ear in the room, the great honor of preserving the Belucci matriarch's legacy. Tommaso sat at the end of the table in his wheelchair and said nothing, though I could see his hand trembling on the tablecloth. I sat at Dario's left, and I could feel my pulse in my teeth. I could hear my mother's voice, steady, the way it had been on the last morning she was well enough to sing with me. When Marzano finished, Dario stood. He did not raise his voice. He never did. He said, "Before we sign, I would like to introduce 2 documents into the record. The first was the notarized charitable use restriction from 1974, which required the Harbor Street building to remain a home for women with nowhere else to go. The second was the 7 eviction notices Marzano's foundation had filed in the past 6 months, along with the cash offer receipts and the 2 license plate photographs of women sleeping in their cars in the alley behind the building." He laid them on the table beside the renderings, one by one, so every man at the table could see them without turning his head. The room went so quiet I could hear a waiter set down a water pitcher 3 tables away. He said, "My mother spent 49 years of her marriage protecting that address in silence. I am not going to spend the rest of my life letting a stranger sell her name to men who will not let poor women through the door." Marzano's smile did not move, but the color did. He said, quietly, that the restriction was old, that lawyers could handle it, that the alliance was worth too much to lose over a boarding house. Dario said, "Then we lose the alliance." He said it the way another man might have said, "Then we take a walk." He said if Marzano signed the transfer of Harbor Street into an independent women's housing trust before dessert, the two families could still discuss shipping, though on very different terms. If Marzano refused, Dario would file every document Miss Delane had assembled with the state attorney general on Monday morning, and every eviction, every wire, every quiet coercion would become public record. Marzano looked at me for the first time. He asked, in a tone meant to be gentle and failing at it, who I was, and what business a maid had at his table. And that is when I stood up. I told him my name. I told him my mother's name. I told him that 54 years ago, in a two-bedroom on the third floor of the very building he intended to gut, a seamstress named Rosa Vale had lent her surname to a frightened girl. That girl was named Evelina Rinaldi, and Rosa had lent it so Evelina could choose, freely, the man she wanted to marry, and could walk into that marriage as a woman and not as a payment. I told him that the final verse of a Sicilian work song had been written in that room, as a promise between two women, that no woman should ever again need a stranger's permission to leave or a stranger's permission to return. And I told him that I had sung that verse 3 weeks ago to a godfather who had not smiled in 11 years, and that his smile was worth more than any alliance in this room, or any check any man in this room could sign. I told him I would sing it again tonight, right here, if a single man at this table doubted that it belonged to me, and I meant it, and every man at that table could hear that I meant it. I did not raise my voice either. I did not have to. Tommaso Belucci, who had not spoken in public in a decade, lifted his head at the end of the table and said, "My wife chose me. She did not owe me. She chose me, and she chose that house too. You will not take it." His voice did not shake. His hands did not shake. He looked at Marzano the way an old lighthouse looks at a coming storm. De Marzano signed the transfer before dessert. He signed the shipping alliance, too, on Dario's terms, which cost his family 1/3 of what they had expected to earn and required him to fund the first 2 years of the new housing trust as a matter of public record. He left the restaurant without finishing his wine. He never came back to the estate, and within a year his foundation had been quietly dissolved, and his own children would not sit at his table. We drove home in silence, the harbor black beside us. Tommaso reached across the seat and took my hand, and this time he did not let go until we were through the iron gates. When the car stopped, he leaned toward me in the dark and said, "Thank you for singing. Thank you for coming to my door. And thank you, most of all, for not walking away from it when I asked who your mother was." Then he kissed my forehead like a father. I did not stay on as a maid. Dario would not have allowed it, and I would not have wanted it. 3 weeks after the dinner, Harbor Street reopened as an independent trust with its own board and its own budget, and I was offered a salaried position coordinating intake for women arriving with less than I had arrived with. I took it. I moved into a small apartment 2 blocks from the water, with a window that faced east. The radiator hissed in the mornings, and the floors creaked in a way I came to love. I paid my own rent for the first time in my adult life, on the 1st of the month, in a check I signed with my own hand. On the weekends, I sang in the front parlor of the boarding house, standards and Sicilian songs both, for women who needed to hear a voice that was not asking anything of them, and sometimes they cried, and sometimes they sang along. Dario courted me the way he did everything else, slowly, quietly, and without leverage. He took me to dinner on a Tuesday, and he asked, the first time he asked, whether he could see me again on a Saturday. He never once paid a bill I could pay myself. He never once mentioned the wages I had earned in his house, or the check I had eventually cashed months later to buy a used upright piano for the parlor at Harbor Street. When I asked him, 6 months in, why he had built our courtship this way, and whether it did not tire him to be so careful, he told me, "Because you are the daughter of a woman who taught mine to choose. I will not be the man who takes that away from you." And then, only then, he asked if he could kiss me, and only after I said yes did he do it, on the front steps of my apartment, in a February wind. Tommaso lived another 4 years. He came to Harbor Street every Sunday until the last one, and every Sunday he sat in the parlor in the same chair, the one nearest the window, and listened to me sing, and every Sunday, at the final verse, he smiled. Some Sundays he brought a small bunch of daisies for the front desk. Some Sundays he brought a story about Evelina I had not heard before, a story about the way she laughed at her own jokes. He told me about the way she hid pastries in the linen closet so the housekeeper would find them and eat something sweet. He told me about the way she once, in 1978, faced down a man twice his size at a Boston fundraiser and how he had loved her for it and never told her so out loud. He told me these things the way a man returns borrowed books, slowly, with a careful gratitude for having had them at all.
Meow.
He died in the spring of 2030, in his own bed, with the window cracked open toward the harbor and the rust-colored shawl folded across his chest. Dario and I were married on a hillside above that same water 18 months later. My mother's shawl went with me down the aisle across my shoulders, and Evelina's went with Dario across his. The priest, who had known Tommaso since childhood, wept during the vows and said Tommaso had asked him, weeks before, to remember to smile. I think, sometimes, of the woman I was on that first morning, polishing a piano in a room I had been told not to enter, humming a verse I did not know I was allowed to sing. I think of my mother, who spent her last breath warning me away from a place that turned out to be the doorway back to her. I think of Evelina Belucci, who wrote a private joke into an old song and trusted a future woman to sing it in the right room. And I think of a godfather who had not smiled in 11 years, who taught me, without meaning to, that grief is only ever a locked door, and that sometimes the only key is a voice you were told to keep quiet. If this story reached you, and if you have ever felt like the smallest person in the room with the largest thing to say, please subscribe and stay with me for the next one. Every quiet woman I have ever known has been carrying a song like mine. Every one of them deserves to be heard by someone who knows enough to listen, and every one of them deserves a doorway back to a mother she thought she had lost forever, and a window someone thought to leave cracked open on her behalf, and a name that was hers before anyone else laid a claim on it. Leave the window open. The woman who leaves by choice is the only woman who ever truly returns. I left, and I came back. And this time, I came back singing, in a room I built with my own hands, for women who did not yet know they were allowed to sing along, and for a man who finally understood what his wife had meant when she asked him whether he could bear to marry a woman who had already learned the shape of leaving. He could, he did, and so, at last, did I.